Michael Jackson's Thriller not only defined an era in pop music, but redefined the standards for a music industry that was very much in decline at the time. It eventually became the biggest selling album of all time, and that was no accident, as there was big ambition from the whole team all along. Michael and ace producer Quincy Jones assembled a best-in-class array of players, writers and engineers with the intention of saving the industry. This is the story of how they did it. Pre-Thriller, it was a bleak time, and staff at CBS referred to August 13th, 1982 as Black Friday. We had a major layoff that day, remembers Epic VP of Merchandising Dan Beck. Half of the marketing department was let go at Epic. It was an upsetting time because nothing like that had ever happened before. Then Thriller changed everything. There is no question that Thriller was the driving force behind what became the hottest run in Epic's history. With Quincy Jones in charge as producer and Bruce Swedien as head engineer, the recording for Thriller officially got underway in April 1982 at Ocean Way Studios for a 2-day session recording The Girl Is Mine. Written by Michael, the duet with Paul McCartney was to be released before the album was complete. Several members of the band Toto featured on the recording, including David Page on piano, the Porcaro brothers Jeff on drums and Steve programming the synths, and Steve Lukather on guitar. They would become mainstays for a lot of the songs on the album, along with Greg Phillinganes on keys and Lewis Johnson on bass. According to Lukather, the band had a quick run through a Stevie Wonder song before laying down the track with Paul and Michael recording their vocals together. Michael said that the recording of The Girl Is Mine was one of his most enjoyable moments in the studio. He explained, "It's one of my favourite songs I recorded as a solo artist, because working with Paul McCartney was pretty exciting and we just had fun." Michael had already written 2 other songs, Wanna Be Starting Something and Billie Jean, and demos for these songs had already been created sometime before. Wanna Be Starting Something dates back to the Off the Wall period and was in part inspired by Cameroonian artist Manu Dibango's song Soul Makossa. For the remaining songs, they called on other songwriters, including Rod Temperton, the ace songwriter from Cleethorpes in England. Rod had already worked with Michael and the team on the Off the Wall album, and once again provided 3 songs: Baby Be Mine, Lady in My Life, and Starlight. Starlight made it past the demo phase of recording, but wasn't considered a strong enough title. So Rod went away and racked his brains for a catchier headliner for the album, and out of hundreds of possibilities settled on Midnight Man. Luckily, he quickly ditched that and went with Thriller instead. Chosen for its cinematic potential, Thriller set the course for what they were trying to achieve, even sonically with sound effects and amazing textures, created by synth programmers such as Anthony Marinelli and Michael Bodica. They even drafted in horror movie star Vincent Price to add some weight to the rap in the song. This rap was hastily written on the way to the studio by Rod, who was normally extremely organised with every part meticulously worked out beforehand. But in this case, he was only told about Vincent a few hours before. Marinelli recalls Michael had a turntable with a bunch of records that would play him to highlight sounds he liked and wanted recreating. Apparently, a big influence was the Minneapolis sound of the time featuring Morris Day, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and interestingly, Prince. The array of synths included the ARP 2600 for things like sound effects, for example the wind on the opening of Thriller, to main parts like its bass line. The Mini Moog, Prophet 5, Yamaha CS80 and Roland Jupiter 8 feature heavily, along with them the synclavier for sounds like the pipe organ on Thriller, and effects such as the opening of Beat It. In amongst all that was the little old Casio MT60 for the Thriller frog sound also. The main drum machine used was a modified Linn drum that had some sounds from the earlier LM1 machine and even the Roland 808 clap. In 1982, it was still difficult for black artists to break through into the mainstream music outlets, and MTV was a prime target for Michael and Quincy. For this, they really felt they needed a crossover record to break through. Quincy's blueprint was the Knack's My Sharona, and he asked Toto's David Page if he could write something. David was working with Steve Porcaro at the time, and the tape that David submitted also had a quick demo of one of Steve's songs on the other side. Quincy duly listened to David's songs, but fatefully his cassette player had auto-reverse and started playing the other side. Quincy's ears immediately pricked up, and he got back in touch with them and asked them to finish the Why song. This turned out to be Human Nature, not quite the My Sharona they were after, but an amazing and fortuitous contribution to the album. The My Sharona song would eventually come from Michael. Beat It was a perfect way to go, with a chugging distorted riff from Steve Lukather and a screaming solo from none other than Eddie Van Halen. Michael actually wasn't in the studio when Eddie came in. He was recording the E.T. Story album, which he had been all throughout the Thriller sessions. Eddie was unimpressed with the bit of the song he was supposed to play on, and instead asked if he could change the arrangement. Quincy obliged, and he proceeded to play 2 different takes, at which point Michael came in and of course loved it. PYT started as just a title that Quincy came up with, and asked James Ingram if he could write a song around it. He delivered emphatically, so much so that Michael was intimidated by James's vocal delivery on the demo, saying to Quincy that there's no way he could do it as well. Quincy G'd him up, of course, and helped Michael kill it on the final recording. A key part of the success of Thriller is its sound. I clearly remember it sounding incredible when it came out, and it sparked my early interest in recording and mixing. In charge of this was the great Bruce Swedien, and it's really interesting, looking into the key techniques to get an appreciation of how he achieved it. Bruce was aware of how much of an effect early reflections had on the perception of sound. Early reflections are the first echoes that bounce back from your environment and essentially blend in with the direct sound. Our ears don't separate the sources, so we hear the whole sound as one. So if you record in stereo, then you open up the scope for this perception even more, in much the same way our ears work. So for the most part, Bruce liked to record in stereo, apart from things like lead vocals, where it would be off-putting to hear it wandering around the stereo field. This even extends to recording direct signals like synthesizers back out through the speakers. Here's a quick example in my studio. The downside to this is a much increased track count, and in the days of tape, meant having to slave 24 track machines together. These were the 3M M79, and Bruce said, "These tape machines were so quiet that you could record a fly pissing on a blotter with them." He wasn't afraid to experiment and use unusual techniques to get the sound he wanted either. For Michael's backing vocals on Billie Jean, specifically the line "Don't Think Twice," he got Michael to sing into a 5-foot-long cardboard tube to get a convincing distance effect. For Leon Ndugu Chancellor's drums on Billie Jean, Bruce wanted a tight and punchy sound and went about separating the kick and snare as much as possible. First with a zip-up cover on the kick with a Sennheiser MD421 inside, and a separator between the hi-hat and the Shure SM57 snare mic, giving him much more control in the final mix, of which Bruce prepared 91 separate mixes. Amusingly, and a good example of how your initial creative instincts are normally the best, they ended up choosing mix number 2. Punchiness and strong transients were high on the agenda as a sonic trait, and he wasn't very fond of overcompression, and was quite lenient with his use of it, saying famously and perhaps controversially that compression was for kids. He did, however, use the 1176 on Michael's vocals, but only a smidge apparently. Also, all the rhythm tracks were first recorded to a separate 24-track reel. The rest of the song would then be recorded to a bounce of this, with the original being kept away and undergraded from multiple playbacks. At the end, the original reel would then be synced up in all its pristine glory later for the final mix. The microphone choice for arguably the most important source, Michael's vocals, was really interesting. Instead of choosing the most hi-fi expensive mic like a Neumann U47, Bruce instead chose the comparatively lowly Shure SM7. To some, it was regarded as a jumped-up SM57 with a pop shield, but not to Bruce. The reason for this seemingly odd choice was all a matter of capturing the character of Michael's voice. Bruce felt that the SM7 was best suited to complement the nuance of his style. He was, however, keen to point out that he preferred the original over the modern SM7B version. When the first test pressing came through, it was clear there was something wrong, as it didn't sound good at all. Michael was so upset that he ran out of the building. There were 2 issues in the main. The time frame to get everything done was so tight that they were essentially mixing as they went along, with no time for objectivity. In fact, the final overdubs were still being recorded the morning of the day the tapes went to mastering. The other and more pertinent issue was the length of the songs. The fidelity of a vinyl record relied on how much sound was crammed onto it, so if you went beyond a certain length, then the quality would quickly drop off. That sweet spot had to be reached. CBS were told the album was unreleasable and needed remixing, causing a lot of upset at the record company, and they weren't keen to oblige them. They did eventually allow time for remixing and mastering though, and after a short break, Michael, Quincy and Bruce spent another week remixing the album, resulting in the final release that became public. The album was released in November 1982, and although it was very well received, it wasn't straight away the phenomenon that it eventually became. We have to remember that the album was released before the run of groundbreaking videos that started with Billie Jean and ultimately culminated with the 15-minute short movie Thriller. Mix in with that Michael's appearance on the Motown 25 show and his introduction of the moonwalk, and you have the ingredients for world domination. The album has been reissued many times. The latest 40th anniversary set includes many of the songs that didn't make it onto the final album. One of these, titled Behind the Mask by Yellow Magic Orchestra, only never made it due to a royalty dispute with Yellow Magic Orchestra's management. I bet they're not too popular with their client now. To date, Thriller is the greatest selling album of all time, with over 70 million copies sold. I think it's safe to say that the boys definitely achieved what they set out to do.